The Forest Path by Bella Pages. Deep in an ancient forest, where oak and maple grew so tall their canopy blocked most of the sunlight, where moss-covered fallen logs and ferns carpeted the forest floor, there wound a narrow path that had been walked for generations. This path connected a small village at the forest's edge to a clearing in its heart, and those who walked it regularly came to know every curve and slope, every notable tree and boulder, every place where water crossed the trail. Among those who walked this path was a woman named Ruth. She lived alone in a cabin at the forest's edge, and each day she walked the path into the forest and back again, sometimes with a specific destination in mind, but more often simply for the pleasure of walking, for the peace that the forest provided, for the quiet communion with trees and birds and the play of light through leaves. Ruth had not always lived in the forest. She had grown up in a suburban neighborhood, in a house that looked much like all the other houses on the street, had gone to schools and university, had worked for many years as an accountant in a mid-sized firm. Her life had been ordinary and respectable, following the expected pattern, checking off the conventional milestones: education, career, marriage, children. But the marriage had ended in divorce when the children were teenagers, an amicable enough separation but still painful, still marking a failure of something she had believed would last forever. The children had grown up and moved away, building their own lives in distant cities, visiting occasionally but absorbed in their own concerns. And Ruth, finding herself alone in her 50s, had looked at the life she had built and felt a profound disconnection from it. The accounting work that had once seemed stable and practical now felt deadening. The suburban house that had sheltered her family now felt empty and too large. The friendships she had maintained for years revealed themselves as superficial, based more on proximity and convenience than genuine connection. Ruth had felt herself becoming invisible, fading into a kind of non-existence, going through motions that no longer held meaning. The change had come gradually. She had started taking walks in a small park near her house, seeking relief from the stifling feeling of her days. These walks had led her to explore further, to drive to larger parks and nature preserves on weekends. And eventually, on a particularly beautiful autumn day, she had found this forest and the village at its edge. She had felt something shift inside her when she first walked the forest path. The tall trees, the dappled light, the soft earth beneath her feet, the smell of decomposing leaves and growing things, all of it had spoken to something deep within her that had been silent for too long. She had walked for hours that day, following the path wherever it led, and when she finally emerged at the trail's end, she had known with complete certainty that she needed to be here, to live near this forest, to make it part of her daily life. The practical steps had taken nearly a year: selling her house, leaving her job, finding the cabin that would become her new home, arranging her finances to support a simpler lifestyle. Her adult children had been concerned, wondering if she was having some kind of breakdown. Her colleagues had been baffled, unable to understand why anyone would give up a secure position and comfortable home. But Ruth had been certain, more certain than she had been about anything in decades. Now, 5 years later, the forest path was as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. She knew where mushrooms appeared after rain, where wildflowers bloomed in spring, where deer liked to bed down in thick underbrush. She knew which trees had been struck by lightning, which had fallen across the path and been cut away, which showed the scars of bare claws where they had climbed in search of food. This evening, As the sun began to descend and the forest took on the golden quality of late afternoon light, Ruth set out on her daily walk. She wore comfortable shoes worn soft from many miles, carried a light jacket in case the evening grew cool, brought nothing else. The path required no map, no special equipment, just her body and her willingness to walk. The trailhead began at the edge of her small property, marked by 2 large oaks that stood like sentinels on either side. Ruth passed between them and immediately felt the forest close around her, the sound of the nearby road fading, the quality of air changing, becoming cooler and richer with the scent of earth and vegetation. She walked at a steady pace, not hurrying but not dawdling, finding the rhythm that her body naturally fell into. Her breathing deepened and slowed, matching itself to her steps. Her mind, which had been occupied with small domestic concerns, what to make for dinner, whether she needed to go to the village tomorrow for supplies, began to quiet, the thoughts becoming less insistent, less demanding of attention. The path beneath her feet was soft, years of fallen leaves creating a cushion that made walking easy. Ferns grew thick on either side, their fronds creating walls of green. Overhead, the canopy filtered the sunlight into moving patterns, spots of brightness shifting across the path as leaves moved in the slight breeze. Ruth noticed everything as she walked, her attention moving from one thing to another in a flowing, natural way. A spider's web stretched between 2 saplings, its silk catching the light and glowing like fine thread. A woodpecker worked at a dead tree, its rhythmic tapping echoing through the forest. A chipmunk scurried across the path ahead of her, pausing to look back before disappearing into the undergrowth. These small observations brought her pleasure, pulled her fully into the present moment. This was one of the gifts the forest had given her, the ability to be here now, to notice what was actually happening rather than being lost in thoughts about past or future. In her old life, she had spent most of her time mentally elsewhere, replaying conversations, worrying about upcoming meetings, planning meals and schedules. She had been physically present but mentally absent, never quite where she actually was. The forest demanded presence. If you did not pay attention, you might miss the beauty right in front of you. The particular way light fell through leaves, the intricate pattern of bark on an old tree, the flash of a bird's wing as it moved through branches. And you might also miss important information, a route across the path that could trip you, a change in weather signaled by the wind, the presence of animals that should be given space. Ruth had learned to walk with awareness, her senses open, her mind receptive but not grasping, not trying to control or interpret everything but simply allowing experience to arise and pass. This quality of attention had gradually extended beyond her forest walks into the rest of her life, changing how she approached daily tasks, how she related to other people, how she experienced her own thoughts and emotions. The path climbed slightly here, rising up a gentle slope. Ruth's breathing deepened with the effort, her leg muscles working, her body warming. She had been in poor physical condition when she moved to the forest, years of sedentary work having weakened her. But daily walking had changed that, had rebuilt strength and stamina, had connected her to her body in a way she had not experienced since childhood. She thought about embodiment, about how disconnected from their bodies many people were, living almost entirely in their heads, treating their bodies as mere vehicles for transporting their brains from place to place. She had been that way herself, aware of her body only when it caused problems, pain or illness or the gradual deterioration of aging. Otherwise, she had ignored it, fed it poorly, moved it too little, given it no attention or care. Now her body was her constant companion, her partner in this life she had built. She felt its strength when she walked, its pleasure when she rested, its needs for food and water and movement. She had learned to listen to it, to respect its signals, to work with it rather than against it. And in return, it had become reliable, capable, a source of joy rather than frustration. At the top of the slope, the path leveled and entered a grove of white birch trees. This was one of Ruth's favorite sections, the pale bark of the birches creating a brightness even in the forest's dimness, their leaves shimmering in the slightest breeze. She paused here, as she often did, to simply stand and look and breathe. The forest was never silent, she had learned. There were always sounds if you listened: wind in leaves, birds calling, insects humming, small animals moving through underbrush, the creek flowing over stones. These sounds created a kind of music, not rhythmic or melodic in the human sense, but complex and layered, constantly changing yet always present. Ruth closed her eyes and just listened. A crow called, harsh and loud, from somewhere above. Smaller birds chirped and twittered in continuous conversation. The wind moved through the birch leaves with a particular rustling sound, different from the sound it made in the oaks or maples. Far off, she could hear the creek, its voice rising and falling as water moved around rocks and over small drops. This practice of stopping and listening had become an important part of her walks. It reminded her to not always be moving toward a destination, but to be present where she was. It trained her attention to subtle things, to details that were easy to miss in the rush of moving forward. It created moments of stillness within the activity of walking, points of rest and reception. Opening her eyes, Ruth continued on. The path curved through the birch grove and then entered a section of older forest where massive oaks and maples grew. These trees were centuries old. Survivors of all that time could throw at them: storms and droughts, diseases and infestations, the encroachment of human development. They stood as witnesses to the passage of generations, as anchors of continuity in a changing world. Ruth felt small among these giants, but not in a diminishing way. Rather, their size and age put her own life in perspective, reminded her that she was part of something much larger and longer than her individual existence. The trees had been here long before she was born and would be here long after she died, growing and changing, sheltering other creatures, playing their role in the forest ecosystem. She thought about legacy, about what we leave behind when we die. In her old life, she had thought legacy meant accomplishments and possessions, things that would mark her passage through the world. Now she understood legacy differently. The trees left their legacy in the seeds they produced, in the oxygen they created, in the shelter they provided, in the way they shaped the forest around them. Their legacy was not separate from their being, but was their being, was the natural consequence of living fully and authentically. What would her legacy be? Perhaps simply this: that she had learned to live with awareness and care, that she had treated the earth and its creatures with respect, that she had found and followed her own path rather than the one others expected of her. Not a dramatic legacy, not one that would be remembered or celebrated, but a real one, a lived one, sufficient unto itself. The path descended now, dropping down toward the creek that ran through the forest's heart. Ruth could hear the water growing louder as she approached, could feel the air growing cooler and damper. The creek was the forest's lifeline. providing water for all the plants and animals that lived here, creating a ribbon of extra fertility where things grew more lushly than elsewhere. She reached the creek and paused at the wooden bridge that crossed it. The bridge was old, its planks worn smooth by countless feet, but it was solid and well-maintained by the villagers who used this path. Ruth stood on the bridge and looked down at the water flowing beneath her. The creek was low this time of year, late summer having reduced its flow to a fraction of the spring torrent. But it still moved steadily, clear water flowing over a bed of smooth stones, creating small rapids and quiet pools. Ruth watched the water move, its constant flow both unchanging and ever-changing, the same creek but never the same water. She thought about impermanence, about how everything was always in motion, always changing, even when it appeared static. The creek flowed on. The seasons turned. Trees grew and died and were replaced by new trees. Her own body changed daily, cells dying and being born, nothing fixed or permanent. Even her thoughts and emotions, which could seem so solid and real, were actually just patterns of electrical activity in her brain, arising and passing away moment by moment. Understanding impermanence had brought Ruth both sorrow and freedom. Sorrow because it meant that nothing lasted, that everything she loved would eventually be lost. But freedom because it meant she did not need to cling so tightly, did not need to try to make things permanent that were by nature temporary. She could enjoy what was present while it was present, knowing it would change, accepting that change as natural rather than fighting against it. Ruth crossed the bridge and continued on the path as it climbed the opposite bank. The forest here was different, more mixed, with evergreens interspersed among the deciduous trees. The ground was carpeted with pine needles in some places, creating a different texture and scent. Mushrooms grew from fallen logs, their shapes and colors wonderfully varied, orange and red and brown and white, smooth and ridged and spotted and plain. She had learned to identify many of the mushrooms, studying field guides, learning which were edible and which poisonous, which were rare and which common. She did not often harvest them, preferring to let them complete their life cycles, release their spores, contribute to the forest's health. But sometimes she would gather a few choice specimens to cook for dinner, and she always felt grateful for these gifts from the forest. The path wound on, climbing and descending, curving around large trees and outcroppings of rock. Ruth walked in a state of relaxed attention, her mind quiet, her body moving easily, her awareness open to whatever arose. Time seemed to stretch and slow, the usual urgency that characterized modern life falling away, replaced by a sense of timelessness, of being outside the normal rush of hours and minutes. She passed through a section where the forest opened up, where some old trees had fallen and created gaps in the canopy. Here, light poured in and a different set of plants thrived, raspberries and blackberries, young saplings competing to fill the gaps, grasses and flowers that needed more sun. Ruth could see where deer had been feeding, their tracks clear in the soft earth, branches of the berry bushes stripped of leaves. This cycle of growth and decay, of old trees falling and new ones rising, of constant change and adaptation, was another of the forest's lessons. Nothing stayed the same. Nothing was guaranteed. The forest that existed today was different from the forest of 50 years ago and would be different again in 50 years. And yet there was continuity, an essence that persisted through all the changes, the forest remaining itself even as every individual tree was replaced. Ruth thought about her own life, about the changes she had experienced, the different versions of herself she had been. The child, the student, the wife, the mother, the accountant, all of these were real, were part of her history, but none of them fully captured who she was. She was not any single role or identity, but the continuous process of becoming, the awareness that persisted through all the changes. The light was beginning to fade now, the sun low enough that it no longer penetrated the canopy, the forest taking on the dimmer, softer quality of approaching evening. Ruth knew she should turn back soon, should return to her cabin before darkness made the path difficult to follow. But she wanted to reach the clearing first, the place in the forest's heart where the path ended. She walked a bit faster, her body knowing the way even in the dimming light. And soon she emerged from the trees into the clearing, a circular space perhaps 50 feet across, ringed by tall pines and filled with grasses and wildflowers. This place felt sacred to Ruth, though she could not say exactly why. Perhaps it was the quality of light here, the way the evening sky was visible overhead, the sense of openness after the enclosing trees. She walked to the center of the clearing and stood, looking up at the sky. It was deepening toward purple, and the first stars were beginning to appear. The air was cool and still, carrying the scent of pine resin and evening dew. Ruth took several deep breaths, feeling her lungs expand, feeling the exchange of air, the continuous gift of breath that sustained her life. She thought about breathing, about how it was both voluntary and involuntary, something she could control if she chose, but that happened automatically if she did not. Breathing connected her inner world to the outer world, brought the atmosphere into her body, and released her body's waste back into the air. It connected her to every other breathing creature, to the trees that produced oxygen, to the vast cycles of gases that circulated around the planet. Standing in the clearing, breathing consciously, Ruth felt her connection to everything around her, felt herself not as separate but as part of the whole, a node in an infinite network of relationships and exchanges. This feeling of belonging, of being part of rather than apart from, was perhaps the deepest gift the forest had given her. In her old life, she had felt isolated, disconnected, alone even in the midst of people and activities. She had experienced herself as a separate individual, competing with other individuals for resources and status, constantly defending her boundaries and protecting her interests. This way of being had been exhausting and ultimately unsatisfying. Here, she had learned a different way. She was not separate from the forest, but part of it. She breathed the air the trees produced. She drank water that had fallen as rain on these trees and filtered through their roots. She walked on earth enriched by centuries of their fallen leaves. She was held and sustained by this ecosystem, and she in turn contributed to it, would eventually become part of it completely when her body returned to the soil. This understanding had changed everything, had shifted her from a stance of opposition and control to one of relationship and participation. She did not need to dominate or exploit the natural world, did not need to reshape it to suit her preferences. She could simply be part of it, living in harmony with its patterns and cycles, taking what she needed while giving back, maintaining the balance that allowed all to thrive. The stars were growing brighter, and Ruth knew she needed to start back. She turned and began walking toward the trees, entering the forest again, following the path by memory and the dim light that remained. The forest at night was different, mysterious, slightly dangerous. Ruth walked carefully, placing her feet with attention, listening for sounds that might indicate the presence of animals. But she was not afraid. She had learned that fear often came from the unknown, from unfamiliarity, and the forest was no longer unknown to her. She knew its sounds and smells, knew what creatures lived here and which were dangerous and which were not. She moved through the forest with respect but not fear, as a participant rather than an intruder. The walk back was meditative, her attention even more focused in the darkness, her other senses compensating for the reduced vision. She felt the path beneath her feet, the slight changes in angle and texture. She heard the forest's night sounds, an owl hooting, small creatures rustling in the underbrush, the creek still flowing in the distance. She smelled the rich earth, the decomposing leaves, the various scents of different trees and plants. By the time she reached her cabin, full darkness had fallen, but the cabin's windows glowed with the lamp she had left burning, welcoming her home. She entered gratefully, closing the door behind her, feeling the comfort of shelter after the openness of the forest. She prepared a simple meal, heated water for tea, sat by her small table eating and drinking while looking out the window at the dark forest beyond. Her body was tired in a good way, muscles pleasantly fatigued from the walk, mind calm and clear. She felt deeply satisfied, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because she had spent the evening exactly as she wanted to, walking in the forest, paying attention, being present. After cleaning up from dinner, Ruth prepared for bed. She moved through her simple routine, washing, changing into night clothes, brushing her teeth. She climbed into bed with a book but found she was too tired to read more than a few pages. She set the book aside, turned off the lamp, and lay in the darkness listening to the forest outside her window. An owl called, its voice carrying through the night. The wind moved through the trees with a sound like waves on a shore. Small creatures moved about in the night, going about their lives while she rested. Ruth felt held by the forest, cradled by it, safe in her small cabin at its edge. Her last thoughts before sleep were of gratitude, for the forest and its paths, for the strength to walk them, for the wisdom to leave her old life and find this new one, for the peace that came from living in alignment with her truest self. And then sleep came, deep and dreamless, her body and mind at rest, surrendering to the darkness, trusting in the morning's return. The forest held her through the night, as it held all creatures, providing oxygen and shelter, maintaining the cycles that made life possible, standing as witness and participant in the great unfolding of existence. And Ruth slept peacefully, knowing she was home, knowing she belonged, knowing she had found her path and was walking it, step by step, day by day, in harmony with the forest and with herself.